What's the deal with Femgore? So over the past few years I've noticed an ever-increasing rise, and I'm certainly not the only one, of a very specific subgenre of feminist horror. A subgenre which the internet has aptly dubbed Femgore. But what exactly is Femgore? What is the point of Femgore? What is the context? How does it show up in media? And how does it relate to the wider world, and why are readers so drawn to it? Because I certainly am. Now, first of all, I will say I could not find an origin for the term Femgore in my searches. I'm not sure who coined the term. I did look up the term Femgore on Google Trends, however, which shows you sort of data on how often terms are being searched on Google, and there has been a noticeable spike from what is almost completely no searches in 2024 to like quite a spike in 2025. Of course, genres often predate terminology, so that's not to say that Femgore can only be applied to 2025 fiction, but it shows that there is an increasing interest in it, and we are starting to conceive of it as this subgenre in its own right. Of course, I think there's also a relation between Femgore and other sort of feminist literary horror subgenres, the rise in popularity of the weird women, weird girl fiction in which women are just kind of letting loose, letting go of control, maybe acting a little bit dark and strange, but not all of those books would necessarily fit into Femgore. So what exactly is Femgore? Femgore is obviously an amalgamation of two words there. We've got femme and gore, and it seems to refer to, or the understanding is that it refers to feminist horror and body horror. So we have female, women-centric horror, which can sort of like meld into the literary space. I think literary horror has been a genre that's been around since the dawn of time, but also which contains body horror. So I wouldn't necessarily count something like The Babadook, which I would call feminist horror, as Femgore. And this body horror can take many forms. I've noticed like a few specific trends within Femgore. There is the cannibalist novel, often depicting women as cannibals and exploring various themes, including the way in which society treats women's bodies through cannibalism. A few titles that immediately come to mind, for example, are The Lamb by Lucy Rose or A Certain Hunger. So while Femgore doesn't have to be cannibalistic, that is sort of like one way in which it can be Femgore. There's also the sort of transformation Femgore, the Femgore that is rooted in bodily transformation, not necessarily just like a psychological transformation, but where it contrasts maybe from, like, you know, the age-old metamorphosis that we see going back into mythology, is that it is quite visceral in that we see and read and hear about the way in which the body transforms. So it's not just that one day she was this and then she is something else, that some sort of like magical mystical spell overcomes her and her body becomes something completely different, but her body goes through literal physical changes which are often excruciating, gruesome and painful. You see this in films like Ginger Snaps, which explores themes of coming of age and the sexualization of young women through the theme of werewolves, and even more, I think, like overtly in more recent films like The Substance, which was obviously like a massive blockbuster. Even like non-horror fans were going out of their way to watch The Substance, at least that's how it felt to me from conversations with friends and people online. And what I found most striking actually about The Substance was the way in which Demi Moore, who plays the older version of herself, transforms into the younger version of herself, played by Margaret Qualley, is that she literally bursts forth from her body, and in order to preserve the older body she has to stitch it up. We see that sort of, again, like visceral, violent sort of transformation in the way it actually affects the body, and through that we explore, obviously, in The Substance, themes of aging and beauty standards and the way that, like, obviously sexism is so inherent in our society. Another slightly less gruesome example, but which I still think falls into body horror, would be Night Bitch, which is a book adapted into a film, and in which we see, again, like very physical transformations in the film. It does end up becoming like a little bit more sanitized, I think, but there are still moments that are clearly intended to kind of like gross out the viewer via kind of like bodily transformation, like with the discovery of like lumps of hair in the body through that transformation. Then we have the female murderer, murderess, or serial killer, where we see the less common female serial killer going out and just killing a bunch of people. That again can take many different forms, and although it can be part of the revenge horror subgenre, in which somebody is sort of like enacting righteous revenge through killing, the violence is part of a revenge plot line, and you've seen this in like horror cinema and literature for decades now. It doesn't have to be, which I think is interesting. One of the things about these sort of like female serial killer murderess when it comes to femgore is that her motivations aren't always necessarily relatable. They're not necessarily rooted in like righteous sort of feelings towards the person being killed, and she's not always a sympathetic character. I think of like books like Victorian Psycho, where we see like various different murders committed, including infanticide, which are entirely unjustifiable, but you are compelled to continue to read about. Then another major way I think femgore can show up in literature and cinema, but which is not like the be all and end all, where there's probably many more themes beyond these four, is through birth and menstruation, essentially tapping into ways in which the menstruating body is already quite a bloody, violent place. And this could be like a major theme, like the film could revolve around like pregnancy, birth and menstruation, or it could be like a minor theme. So again, like I think of Immaculate, the film in which Sydney Sweeney's character is impregnated against her will and has to like cope with the changes in her body, and without spoiling it, things like descend from there. Perhaps more subtly again in like Night Bitch or in The Lady Upstairs, we see like the realities of menstruation depicted quite casually, which you don't often see. And through these premises, femgore can obviously explore a variety of themes, from grief to sort of sexualization of women, to sexism, to bodily autonomy, and many more beyond that. I'm not going to spend this video defending horror to you. I think it has been proved time and time again that horror, like any other genre, can be both like subversive, transgressive, insightful, can play like a larger role in society, as well as just be simply entertaining. If you consider horror as a genre simply trash, you don't have to like it, but if you consider it trash, then I would suggest you maybe try some more, because there is a lot within the horror subgenre, just like with any genre, and things are going to appeal to different people. But one question I will talk about briefly is, why do women like horror, and why are women perhaps drawn to horror? Because I was recently listening to Feeding the Monster, which is a non-fiction book about sort of modern horror culture, and the author talked about one time early on in her career as a film critic who specialised in horror, where she was invited on to a podcast, and one of the themes of this podcast was how feminism can marry with horror as a genre that is often associated with the brutalisation of women's bodies. And the author was asked how can she, as a women, enjoy horror which is often violent towards women. And there are two topics I think you need to talk about in this situation, one of which is, yes, there is a massive problem in horror, as there is in like most genres. I also find this quite true of the crime and literary fiction genres, where women, even if they're not being brutalised, are often like caricaturised or demonised or demeaned or infantilized or sexualised and become these one-dimensional beings. And really the woman has nothing to do with the woman herself, but her existence is purely for the presumed male viewer. And that is something which Alice Bolin explores in the title essay of her collection Dead Girls, where she talks about the trope in media in like crime and leaning into horror, where we have a female victim who often does not exist in her own right, and we rarely meet her before she dies. We see her only after she is dead. She's often like a young idealized version of a woman, and her storyline only exists in order to further the emotional growth and the emotional storyline of, say, a male detective or a male family member. But on the flip side, I think allowing this issue, which exists within horror and wider media, to kind of colour your entire perception of horror is to misunderstand horror. The original inventor of horror, if you can even have an inventor of a genre, is often credited as Mary Shelley via her novel Frankenstein, which has also continued to have an influence on the horror genre and the science fiction genre for many, 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 many decades. And as subgenres like Femgore show, but also like wider sort of feminist horror subgenres show, horror can actually be an incredible way to explore the fears and the violence, whether psychological or physical, of the lived experiences of women. I mean, really, what is more horrifying than the genuine mistreatment and discrimination that women often face in reality? And that is true of all oppressed groups in society. But why exactly, I don't know if you can hear me over claps, but why exactly is it Femgore that we're so drawn to in recent years? Of course, before I give my own perspective, I was curious to see what some authors writing in this subgenre were saying. So in an interview with Virginia Fueto, who is the author of Victorian Psycho, her answer to this question was, because we were late to the game. Because until recently, women were supposed to be lovely and obedient martyrs, and nobody wanted to read books with gross female characters in them. So we're just having the time of our life now, discovering the nuances of a genre that still feels very fresh and incredibly satisfying. And I feel like the word gross is very key there. Jessie Elland, in a video interview, meanwhile, talked about how Femgore is obviously something which contains a lot of blood and references back to actually much older horror films like Alien, and how actually lots of women's experience of being a woman involves a lot of blood. And I thought that was a really interesting take, something that comes up in her book as well, this idea that really, like, from a very young age, women as well as trans men and non-binary folks who have cervixes encounter blood on a monthly basis. It's a big part of our lives. And to me, what that is a symbol of is the reclamation of women's bodies. We are sort of reclaiming the female body, the one that has been infantilized, overly sexualized against our will within horror and wider society, and taking that back and reclaiming our own bodies, saying these are our bodies, and they don't have to be perfect idealized versions of what women should be. They can be gross and they can be disgusting, or at least what people might consider gross or disgusting, although there is clearly an intent behind a lot of these books and these films to kind of gross out and disgust the viewer, but also make them ask why they're disgusted and grossed out by that. So I think that's an interesting thing that's at play as well. It's difficult to talk so broadly about a genre when lots of books actually do very different things within it. We have very different characters, some of which I've already mentioned are not as sympathetic as others, but which Femgore allows to be gross and disgusting and rageful, and uses that to explore very real rage, fear and trauma. And this brings us back to something that horror author Carmen Maria Machado said more broadly about horror, which is that when you enter into horror, you're entering into your own mind, your own anxiety, your own fear, your own darkest spaces. And that becomes very visceral in Femgore. And I also think it's worth noting that Femgore can also be inclusive of all women, including trans women, which I think is demonstrated by books like Brainworms by Alison Rumfitt, who is one of like my favourite horror writers writing today. But why now? Why is Femgore the genre seemingly of the moment? And I do find it interesting that in the like sort of 2 or 3 articles I could find about Femgore online, there was an immediate sort of contrast with Femgore and romantasy. Romantasy supposedly, according to these articles, being the genre of 2024, whereas now we're moving into Femgore, which I think is a kind of misunderstanding of the way in which we consume media. Well, I personally certainly go through phases of my reading, and I might read 3 books back to back which are in a similar genre. My tastes coexist, and I actually think things like the upsurge in romance and in feminist horror are part of something similar, and they both fill a different void in women's lives when you are dealing with everyday sexism and the like increasing restrictions on your bodily autonomy. And I think it very much is these ever increasing attacks on women's bodily autonomy, which is part of the reason we are finding ourselves so drawn to Femgore. One prominent example of this is, of course, increasing restrictions on abortion across the world. Since the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US, almost half of US states have very, very tight restrictions on abortion that make it virtually impossible, or only under very, very limited circumstances in a very, very limited window of time in which you can gain an abortion. Meanwhile, in 2021 in Poland, abortion was effectively made illegal, and even in countries like my own in Scotland, or in wider Scotland, Wales and England, which have some of the best like abortion laws, facilities, and sort of like options for those seeking an abortion, it is incredibly accessible in comparison to a lot of other countries, but abortion continues to be under threat, and increasingly so. If you are in the UK, you might be aware that recently new guidance was handed out to the police in the UK, which basically gives them the right, or encourages them to use the right to sort of search women's phones and homes in the case of a miscarriage in order to ascertain whether this was something which they initiated themselves, essentially like violating their like personal data during a moment which is one of the most traumatic things that you can experience. And politicians like Nigel Farage, who thanks to countless years of media pandering to has gained more prominence in the UK and finally got in his seat as an MP, is trying to lower the abortion limit, or is at least putting that forward as an issue in Parliament. So even if you're looking at one country and thinking, wow, I can't believe they're doing that, this doesn't affect my country, thank God we're more progressive, remember that it very much can, and things can change very, very quickly. And I do think threats like that to abortion are something which is playing in the back of our mind when we are seeking out femgore. Another issue is with the increasing rise of things like deep fakes and the use of AI to create incredibly violating images of women where their bodies are either replaced or their faces are used on other people's bodies, and their voices are appropriated to create pornographic images that they were not involved in, or even upward trends in revenge porn where people are leaking and sharing intimate images that women did not consent to be shared. This is obviously a huge topic which I can't cover every aspect of in this video, but I would highly, highly encourage you to read the new Age of Sexism by Laura Bates, which does do a deeper dive into this topic in an accessible way, but which is obviously incredibly like gut-wrenching, but important. So I think those are also things in which our bodies are being taken from us or are being replaced effectively, that can again be sort of connected to our desire for this femgore genre in cinema and in book form and even in television form. I have to say that I also think shows like Yellow Jackets definitely have themes of femgore within them. They're not exclusively femgore, there's also themes of folk horror in there, but so is femgore, especially with aspects of cannibalism and bodies adapting and changing in the wilderness. So I guess what I'm saying is, like with any genre or subgenre of media or format of media, it can't really be taken out of the wider context of the world that it exists in, and there is obviously a correlation between the world we currently live in and the rise of femgore. And despite the fact that horror has almost become mainstream today and is gaining increasing popularity in book sales and in cinema goers, it is a genre which can still be heavily associated with and dominated by men. Most of the big like Hollywood horror blockbusters still have male writers and directors. But what if you're just getting into femgore? What should you read and what should you watch? This is the portion of the video with the book and film recommendations. Of course, I've already touched on quite a few titles and some of those are going to be coming up again in this section, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about why I love them, and maybe also touch on some of the books that are on my TBR, because my femgore TBR is tall. Before I get into the fiction, however, I do want to mention or re-mention the two non-fiction books that I already brought up in this video, because I think they would be excellent companions to this reading material, and one of those is of course The New Age of Sexism by Laura Bates, which is all about sexism in a digital age and the way in which sexism is being built into AI and new technologies online, and Feeding the Monster by Anna Bogatskaya, which is all about why horror has a hold on us with a particular focus on contemporary horror, why the genre is so popular and what it says about us. It's a fascinating read if you've ever doubted the value of horror. In terms of novels, you might want to try The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim, which is specifically about the way in which Asian women are fetishized. In particularly Western society, we have a young woman living in the US with her mother and her sister after her father has left them, and her mother enters into a new relationship with a white man that makes them all incredibly uncomfortable. Well, not her mother, but her and her sister incredibly uncomfortable, and how she is coping with all of that going on around her and how that seeps into a growing desire to eat. Specifically eyeballs. Victorian Psycho seemingly takes inspiration from American Psycho, but it is about a governess in the Victorian era with an intent. We don't know what that intent is at the very beginning of the novel, but she clearly took on this position for a reason, and she has reasons to be here. But she also completely lacks empathy and therefore will do anything that crosses her mind, including acts of brutal violence if that is just like what she wants to do in the moment. And as the novel goes on, it becomes increasingly violent. Lady Upstairs is another historical novel about a maid who becomes a lady's maid, so she is promoted. But from the very beginning of the novel, you see how she is essentially disgusted by the world around her. She feels that she is constantly surrounded by sin, she is constantly scrubbing her skin, and she talks about how disgusting she finds the bodies of those around her that are essentially in her same class, and she aspires to this much higher class that she considers godly and sin-free. And is it as perfect when she gets there? The short stories of Mariana Enriquez are like a melding of genres. They're short stories, so while not all of the stories are femgore, some are more like ghost stories and haunting stories, I do think some of them fall into this category. And just generally I love Mariana Enriquez's writing style, so this is Things We Lost in the Fire and The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. In terms of my TBR, apparently it's all about the cannibals. We have The Lamb by Lucy Rose, which is about a young woman and her mother who live in the wilderness or somewhere isolated and maybe feast on flesh. We will find out. As well as A Certain Hunger, which is about Dorothy, who is a food critic, but she desires something very specific from her meals deep within her, and it's about how that desire eventually overwhelms her. As far as I know, these two are on my TBR and I'm just very excited to read them. A recent release that I just read was Kill Creatures by Rory Power, which while I don't think is like full femgore, like it's not the most explicit book in the world, I do think sort of like toes that line specifically within the young adult genre. So Rory Powers writes young adult horror, and I think in many ways all of the books she's written, having read them, sort of fulfill femgore to an extent, and they are kind of like the YA equivalent, so they might also be a great way to ease into this genre if you're not typically someone who reads body horror. Then for films, you might want to check out The Substance or Immaculate, which maybe toes the line of femgore, and even Peril. I'm also intrigued by The Ugly Stepsister, which looks like it's going to be a femgore take on the Cinderella fairy tale. I haven't seen it yet, I've only seen the trailer, but I don't know if it's going to be like too gruesome for me. Even though I love femgore, there are certain things that on screen I struggle with witnessing, so I am intrigued, but we'll have to find out what the reviews say. But from a selfish perspective, what I'd really love is more recommendations from you. Have you read any books or films, both recent and older, which you think might sort of fulfill the requirements for the femgore subgenre? Even if you haven't considered them femgore in the past, now that we've talked about it a little bit more in detail, are there books and films which you think, maybe that is femgore? Because I've definitely had that with a few older books and films that I've seen. As I've been thinking through this subgenre, it might be a seemingly more recent term, but that doesn't mean it doesn't backdate. So I'd love to know what you think sort of fulfills the criteria. I'd also love to know what your thoughts more generally are on the subgenre of femgore and maybe more broadly feminist horror. Are you a horror fan? Have you always been a horror fan, or is it something you're just getting into now? Let me know, because this is something I'm just really interested in and would love to like chat about more broadly. So I'm hoping that this comment section is really going to like fulfill that desire for me to have a conversation about these subjects. I hope you enjoyed this video essay. Let me know if you would like future videos like this, maybe future deep dives on more subgenres like folk horror, which is another favourite of mine, or something like romantasy perhaps, which is seemingly so disconnected from things like femgore. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!